So Conor Benn and Chris Eubank Jr are scheduled to fight each other on April 26th in the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium, in a long-awaited bout that has been spoken about for several years due to their father's great rivalry. But the fight was of course originally scheduled to take place over 2 years ago now, on October 8th, 2022, but that fight was cancelled just 2 days out due to Conor Benn's drug test failure. The cancellation of the original scheduled fight and the controversy surrounding Conor Benn as a result of that has of course allowed the rivalry to brew into an even bigger grudge match, if the selling point of them continuing on their father's rivalry with each other wasn't enough of a selling point to a casual audience already. But today, in preview of Conor Benn vs Chris Eubank Jr, I'm not quite here to look back at Nigel Benn and Chris Eubank Sr.'s 2 great fights against each other and their bitter feud and how their personalities clashed and all that. Instead, I'm going to be looking at some of the parallels between Nigel Benn and Chris Eubank Sr.'s respective lives and careers, some of the similar controversies and tragedies that both men were involved with, and how some of those things link with the 2 sons. So yes, this is the family affair that is Conor Benn vs Chris Eubank Jr. To start off a bit heavy, we are going to take a look back at the tragedies that both Nigel Benn and Chris Eubank Sr. were involved with. So Nigel Benn and Chris Eubank Sr.'s 2 fights were quite spread apart. The first one taking place in November of 1990, in which Eubank TKO'd Benn in a great fight, and the second one taking place in October of 1993, in which the 2 men fought to a draw, a controversial decision in a fight that many people thought Nigel Benn deserved to win. So a lot happened in each man's career in the meantime. Nigel Benn had 10 fights in between the 2 fights of his duology with Chris Eubank, and Eubank had 11 fights in between. And within those 11 fights for Eubank came another duology that did consist of an immediate rematch, that being his 2 fights with Michael Watson in 1991. Now for those of you who don't know, Michael Watson was no joke. When Eubank stopped Nigel Benn in 1990, he wasn't the first guy to beat Benn. Michael Watson was, in 1989. All the hype was behind Nigel Benn going into the Benn vs Watson fight, as Benn was just running through everyone. But Michael Watson put on a smart and meticulous boxing performance and absorbed a lot of Benn's power shots on his solid guard until Watson let Benn gas himself out and subsequently knocked Benn out with a jab in round 6. So yeah, Eubank vs Watson was therefore a big fight in British boxing, and the 2 men's first fight took place on June 22nd of 91, and the 2 men had a closely contested and highly competitive bout that went the 12-round distance. And Chris Eubank got the nod by majority decision in that one. But many fans, pundits, and Watson himself of course, reckoned that Michael Watson deserved the win over Eubank. A straight up robbery was widely touted as in the media in fact, so obviously that warranted an immediate rematch. So yes, that takes us to Chris Eubank vs Michael Watson 2 on September 21st of 91, just 3 months after their first fight. And this fight was taking place at White Hart Lane, Tottenham Hotspur's old stadium funnily enough, because Conor Benn vs Chris Eubank Jr is set to take place in the new Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. Now this was a very eventful back and forth fight, but again Michael Watson was just getting the better of things in there for the most part, and was comfortably ahead, on 2 of the 3 judges' scorecards at least, going into the 11th round. But in the latter stages of the 11th, the fight reached an insane climax that actually went on to be tragic. So the 2 men were just scrapping in there, but in typical Michael Watson fashion, being the great boxer he was picking the better shots and looked to have more left in the gas tank than Eubank. So he was really putting it on Eubank to where he scored a knockdown with just 18 seconds to go in the round. But Eubank just got straight back up and went up to Watson and just led with a brutal right uppercut that Watson didn't see coming, and Watson's head hit the rope hard. Now although Watson got straight back to his feet, unfortunately, unbeknownst to everyone at the time, that right uppercut was the punch that did it. But yeah man, Watson was just out of it in the corner between rounds, but he still entered the 12th and final round. But he just didn't look like he had the wherewithal to even stand as the final round started. But Eubank put it on him and gained a TKO victory on the feet early in the 12th, for what was, at that very moment in time, a tremendous come from behind win for Eubank against the superior boxer to win the vacant WBO super middleweight strap. But I'm sure most of you know that that isn't what that fight is remembered for. Unfortunately, Watson suffered lifelong brain injuries as a result of that fight. There were no ringside doctors to give Michael Watson immediate treatment, and there was a bunch of people in that ring, and the man just wasn't attended to quickly enough, and by the time he got to the hospital, his brain had been deprived of oxygen for too long and the permanent damage was done. He was in a coma for 40 days and had a blood clot on the brain which took 6 brain operations to heal. And for his first year of recovery, he was still working his way back to even be able to speak and walk. And although he did recover and became capable of such things again eventually, he was left with permanent partial paralysis. and this is something that eats away at Chris Eubank Sr. to this day, understandably so. And stay tuned for how this incident links to Eubank Jr. So yeah, a hefty start there. Chris Eubank nearly ended a man's life in the ring. So of course, going in order, we're going to move on to a very similar thing that happened in the career of Nigel Benn now. But not just yet. I hate to say it, but Chris Eubank Sr. didn't just nearly end a man's life. Less than a year after that Michael Watson fight, in August of 1992, Chris Eubank inadvertently ended the life of a building site worker in a car accident. He accidentally swerved and lost control of the car and strayed off the road while driving carelessly, driving into the man. So the tragedies concerning the Eubanks go beyond the ring. But now let's move on to 1995 and get on the topic of Nigel Benn. So the date was February 25th of 1995, and Benn was defending his WBC super middleweight title against the G-Man, Gerald McClellan. Now Gerald McClellan was a big favourite coming into this fight, at 1-3. The guy was on a 14 fight knockout streak, and a 3 fight round 1 knockout streak. The most recent of those being his second knockout victory over Julian the Hawk Jackson. But Nigel Benn on the other hand was 3 fights removed from his last knockout win, so everyone just expected the G-Man to get rid of Nigel Benn, probably in the first. And before the fight would commence, the graphic only showed the round betting odds for Gerald McClellan, which is just diabolical, and that was on the UK broadcast as well. So yeah, it was just about which round in the first half of the fight Gerald McClellan would knock Benn out in. The one thing that Benn had over McClellan though, was that Benn was the defending super middleweight champ at the time, a weight class that he had been campaigning in for 2 years, and this was to be Gerald McClellan's debut at super middleweight. Oh, and by the way, McClellan weighed 3 pounds below the super middleweight limit at the official weigh-ins. So when the fight took place, it was a frenetic start, and yes, the bookmakers got it right, huh? Early in round 1, Gerald McClellan knocked Nigel Benn out of the ring. What a way to get it done in the first round. But no, Nigel Benn climbed back into the ring and the fight would go on. McClellan threw the kitchen sink at Nigel after the knockdown for the whole rest of the round, but Nigel Benn made it out of the round through erratic low bobbing and weaving and the odd swing back at McClellan. And in the second, McClellan looked somewhat tired from the onslaught that he put on in the first, and Nigel Benn did seem to get the better of the second round and was right back into the fight. So from round 2 on, it was a competitive back and forth scrap, not a boxing match, a straight up fight at a frenzied pace. It was definitely not the cleanest, a lot of grabbing and tussling on the inside, but yeah, pure scrap. To note though, Benn was more so the perpetrator of that pace and that type of fight, and McClellan was more poised in there, trying to pace himself and pick powerful single shots, some of which were landing, and some of which Nigel's erratic evasions got him out of the way of. But even if you do score more of the rounds to McClellan, this was a W on Nigel's part, as McClellan looked like he wanted Benn out of there in the first round, but he couldn't keep that same energy up in the preceding rounds, so Nigel Benn was the one dragging him into the deep waters. So before this fight, Gerald McClellan had never been past the 8th round, but it looked as if McClellan didn't have to fight on past the 8th round just like all his other fights to date, that he could get the W within 8 rounds again, as he gained control back to hurt Nigel Benn in the 8th and scored a knockdown. Second knockdown of the fight scored for the G-Man. But Nigel Benn was back throwing punches at McClellan within seconds of the knockdown, and of course made it out of the round. Then about halfway through round 9, Gerald McClellan complained about a headbutt from Nigel Benn, and took a knee and a little breather, looking rather distraught. The two men then went back and forth for the remainder of the round, but Gerald McClellan's heavy blinking was noticeable. In the 10th round now, Benn would put the pressure on McClellan and landed a clean right hand to the jaw, followed up by a clubbing right hand that forced McClellan to take another knee, which was a knockdown this time. McClellan's chin held up, but he looked very uncomfortable in there. McClellan continued on after the count, but Nigel kept on him and landed another clubbing blow, followed up by a right uppercut that had McClellan taking another knee shortly after. He looked like he was struggling to breathe as he took another knee and was blinking very heavily, and he would not continue on in the fight. So Nigel Benn had done it. Round 10 TKO victory for Nigel Benn to retain his world title in a wild fight. So yes, this was a big come from behind victory, stepping in as the underdog and surviving 2 knockdowns to come back for the stoppage win in a great fight. Benn was actually behind on 2 of the 3 judges' scorecards when the fight finished, which is understandable after the 2 10-8 rounds. But for Benn, surviving a knockdown is one thing, but climbing back into the ring after being knocked down in round 1 by a literal round 1 knockout artist and going on to win in the later rounds is a whole different level. But unfortunately, Gerald McClellan didn't just take a knee and quit because he didn't fancy it anymore. He walked back to his corner and looked absolutely out of it, and eventually collapsed and had to be stretchered out and off to hospital. A blood clot would have to be surgically removed from his brain, and he was in a coma for 11 days after the fight. So very similar stuff to Michael Watson's injury here. As a result of the fight, Gerald McClellan had permanent extensive brain damage and became fully blind, partially deaf, and had lost the ability to walk unassisted. This is obviously something that eats away at Nigel Benn, much like the Michael Watson situation eats away at Eubank. So two very similar situations for the two rivals Nigel Benn and Chris Eubank Sr. in their respective careers. Both men were in fights that they were expected to lose and were losing, and both men survived knockdowns to come back and gain a stoppage victory in bouts that tragically caused lifelong brain injuries to their opponents. But the aftermath of the Eubank Watson situation and the Benn McClellan situation are very different. A lot muddier on the Benn vs McClellan side, but I will touch on that later. So remember, within a year of the Eubank Watson fight, Eubank was involved with a tragedy outside of the ring when he accidentally ended a man's life while driving. Well now, just over a year and a half after Nigel Benn's fight with Gerald McClellan, on September 28th of 1996 to be exact, one of Nigel Benn's best mates, or former best mates, Rolex Ray Sullivan, was brutally attacked at the Legends nightclub in London. He was smashed in the face with a glass in an attack that disfigured and sliced up his face and left him needing 106 stitches and plastic surgery, and Nigel Benn was accused as the man who attacked his old pal Ray. Nigel was charged by the police with Section 18 wounding with intent, and Nigel Benn spent the night in a cell and had to attend court the next day. The trial between Nigel Benn and Ray Sullivan was a wild one, and amidst the ongoing trial, Nigel Benn was also accused of bribing Ray Sullivan to drop the case, offering money for Sullivan to do so, but threatened his life if he didn't drop the case, allegedly. Now there is a lot more to this situation that is covered on this video on the channel Inquirer 2.0, so I'll leave a link in the description for that one. Gotta plug it here because I'm getting all of this information about the Nigel Benn Ray Sullivan situation from there, but please do get through my video before clicking that link. But ultimately, Nigel Benn was found not guilty in this trial. So yeah, an allegation of a brutal attack outside the ring here for Nigel Benn, and although he was found innocent in court here, it is known that Nigel Benn was a wild guy outside of the ring as well as between the ropes. He was involved with gangsters and stuff, and there are stories of him bashing people up and all that. So yeah, it was just pure chaos in the man's life back then. So we've discussed both Chris Eubank Sr. and Nigel Benn's fight from the 90s that resulted in their respective opponents being injured. But now we fast forward all the way to 2016 for the next incident, and we finally get to talk about one of their sons. So the date was the 26th of March 2016, and Chris Eubank Jr. was challenging Nick Blackwell for Blackwell's British middleweight title. Now in this fight, the challenger Chris Eubank Jr. was just piecing up Blackwell, to be totally honest. Combinations of hooks and uppercuts, and those uppercuts were breaking through the high guard of Nick Blackwell clean a lot of the time. The first sign of visible damage on the part of Blackwell is when his nose started to bleed in round 4, probably from all of those right uppercuts through the guard, and in the preceding rounds, things just started to get more one-sided as it went on. Eubank couldn't miss on Blackwell in the 7th round, and was making his face more of a bloody miss. Round 8, things definitely weren't getting any better for Blackwell at all. Eubank was kinda smashing him up at this point, and the swelling above Blackwell's left eye was becoming quite visible. A case could definitely be made for a referee stoppage in this round. And there was a case for a stoppage in that round in the eyes of Eubank Sr. as well apparently, because in the corner after this round, Eubank Sr. expressed his dismay with the ref not stopping the fight after all the damage his son was doing to his opponent, so he told his son to take Blackwell out to the body rather than to the head. So Eubank Sr. was clearly concerned for Blackwell's well-being here and didn't want this to be another Michael Watson situation, showing just how much that tragic incident continued to eat away at Sr. So Eubank Jr. did tone things down a bit in the 9th, as opposed to the 2 previous rounds, but it wasn't exactly this onslaught of exclusively body shots to get the fight finished that Sr. asked for. Then in the 10th, the damage that Eubank Jr. had done to Blackwell urged the referee to call the ringside doctor to check on Blackwell, whose head swelling was very visible at this point. And due to that massive swelling on his head above the left eye that made him unable to see out of that eye, the fight was stopped. So this doctor stoppage meant a round 10 TKO victory for Chris Eubank Jr. and he was the new British champion of the middleweight division. So minutes after the fight had finished, Nick Blackwell collapsed in the ring and the medical team attended to him. They gave him oxygen and he was stretchered out and off to the hospital. Now Nick Blackwell actually technically died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital, and thankfully he was resuscitated and brought back to life. So Nick Blackwell had a bleed on the skull and was placed in a medically induced coma. No surgery was needed and he was brought out of the coma after a week. After his miraculous recovery from his bleed on the skull and flatlining in the ambulance truck, he seemed in pretty decent health, but needless to say, he retired from boxing after the incident. Well, he had to obviously. Blackwell actually said that he did not remember any of the fight with Eubank Jr, showing an immediate effect on his memory, and it is also very tragic that his career ended as a result of the fight, a sport that the man dedicated his life to. Now, even though Blackwell's fight with Eubank Jr started things off, it was an incident that took place several months later, after that March 2016 fight, that really worsened things. So it shouldn't need to be said that the guy should never be getting in the boxing ring again, as he had a brain injury, and he was not licensed to do so by the British Boxing Board of Control. But he acquired a British Boxing Board of Control trainer's license in October, and this was his way back into involvement with boxing, the sport he loved so much. But because he apparently started to feel like his old self again, on November 22nd of 2016, 8 months after that fateful Eubank Jr fight, he got in the ring and did several rounds of sparring with a light heavyweight boxer Hassan Karkadi at the Devices Boxing Club. And yeah, things really took a turn for the worse here. So Blackwell collapsed in the ring after the spar, much like he had collapsed in the ring after the Eubank Jr fight. When Blackwell was sent to the hospital, he would require surgery this time. He required surgery to reduce a swelling on his brain. They would have to cut out a section of his skull to relieve the swelling, and place that section of his skull into his stomach to keep it alive. He was actually given a very slim chance to survive as a result of this very ill-advised sparring session. Apparently he was given a 75% chance of not making it out alive, and an 85% chance of being paralysed down his left side for life. The November 22nd incident also had him in a coma until December 23rd. And once he regained consciousness, he would have to undergo extensive physical therapy to learn to walk and talk again properly. Thankfully, he recovered fully in regards to being able to carry out these basic functions. But this second incident did have a permanent impact on Blackwell's overall health. Unfortunately, he was never the same again after that spar. So yes, Eubank Jr ended the man's boxing career, much like his father ended Michael Watson's boxing career. But luckily for Blackwell, he had received better immediate medical attention and returned to his normal self, minus being a fighter. But it was his passion for the sport that led to his greater demise months after the Eubank Jr fight, when he couldn't help but get back in and do a full sparring session. So the Eubank father and son duo's respective experience with ending a man's career and impacting their brain health were very different, but I still wouldn't say that they both experienced the same thing. And it's of course also rather coincidental that Eubank Sr.'s greatest rival, whose name is intrinsic with his, Nigel Benn, was also involved in such a tragic affair. It would be a crazy coincidence if Nigel Benn's son Conor Benn became involved with such an incident too, right? But for now, that is not the case, and we hope it remains that way. So yeah, that was a lot of very tragic stuff there in and out of the ring, involving both Nigel Benn and Chris Eubank Sr. and Chris Eubank Jr. as well in the ring. There were 5 men on the receiving end of these tragic events, one of whom lost their life, the man on the receiving end of the car accident, so RIP to that guy of course, and the other 4 were never the same again after the incidents, that being Michael Watson, Gerald McLennan, Ray Sullivan and Nick Blackwell, and their lifelong injuries would have and will continue to be tough for them and their families to deal with, so thoughts and prayers go out to anyone involved in all that. The state those men were left in shouldn't be wished on anyone. And just to reflect back on those incidents in the ring, yes, the Eubank Watson situation and the Ben McLennan situation are so very different in regards to the backlash to those fights and the damage they had done. As for the Eubank Watson situation, it is very understandable that Eubank had a great deal of guilt for the damage he inflicted on his opponent that night. But when it really comes down to it, he kinda does have a clear conscience when it comes to that fight, because he was just competing in there and he finished Michael Watson fair and square in that fight. But many would argue that the same couldn't be said about Nigel Benn's stoppage victory over Gerald McLennan. And as for Michael Watson being permanently injured, now anywhere you look you will hear that Michael Watson, as well as being a great boxer, was truly an upstanding and nice man. So the entire boxing community and even just general public here in Britain were mutually saddened about Michael Watson's fight for his life. But the same can't be said about Gerald McLennan. So yes, the Nigel Benn and Gerald McLennan ordeal gets sticky on both sides of the fence, and in every way, shape and form really. But as for the Chris Eubank Michael Watson situation, the heat all fell on the British Boxing Board of Control for their negligence in regards to not having the right health and safety staff and apparatus readily available to give Michael Watson the correct treatment he needed after being in the state that he was in. or any other boxer that would have ended up in Michael Watson's position that night. The lack of ringside doctors ready to attend to him and give him oxygen, and the fact that he was taken to the wrong hospital at first that didn't have a neurosurgery unit, meant that his brain was deprived of oxygen for way too long, leading to those long-lasting injuries. The Eubank Watson 2 fight of course took place in 1991, but fast forward to 1999, when Watson had made great improvements in his recovery, justice was served when he sued the British Board of Control for negligence, which the High Court ultimately found the board guilty of, and Michael Watson was thus awarded £1 million in damages. The Michael Watson incident was also a pivotal moment in boxing history, and it changed the duty of care threshold for the British Boxing Board of Control forever, to where there are now much higher standards for safety. And as much as we ought to celebrate the fact that the British Boxing Board of Control were brought to justice, we should also commend Michael Watson himself, and all of those who aided his recovery, in their efforts to bring him back to somewhat of a normal state after the way he was as a result of that fight, and with his diminishing chances of survival, let alone being able to walk again. Especially his brain surgeon Peter Hamlin, who miraculously saved his life through 6 brain surgeries. Now, in the first 8 months after the fight, Michael Watson couldn't hear, speak or feed himself, and fast forward to 2003, he was no longer in a wheelchair and actually walked the London Marathon, and both Chris Eubank and Peter Hamlin joined Michael Watson for the last leg of the marathon. And this also speaks to Chris Eubank and Michael Watson's great relationship even after the fight. No hard feelings at all. Michael Watson was a forgiving man and remained a man of faith after such a life-altering incident. And of course Chris Eubank has expressed his sorrows, and Michael Watson has expressed his forgiveness, both publicly. So yeah, that Eubank Watson stuff was all about the board and the safety procedures in boxing in general. No heat fell on individuals such as fighters, the trainers or the referee in there. But now we take a look to the mess that was the backlash of the Benn vs McLennan fight, where heat did fall on such parties. So with Nigel Benn, as for what happened between the ropes, many people point out the constant rabbit punches to the back of the head from Nigel Benn. Now back of the head blows are of course illegal in boxing due to being highly dangerous. It can cause a bleeding of the brain and blindness, both of which Gerald McLennan suffered as a result of the fight. And if you watch the fight back, it is fair to say that some of those clubbing blows in close from Benn did stray round to the back of the head of McLennan a good few times. So perhaps Nigel Benn's cheating and dirty tactics contributed to the deterioration of his opponent's health, which does in a sense paint Nigel Benn out as the bad guy here. But there is a good argument that as a fighter, you were just doing what you can for the win in there, especially given the fact that Nigel Benn was in a pretty messed up state himself after that first round, and probably wasn't in the best physical shape due to his lack of discipline out of the ring, let's say. So he was just fighting off of instincts, right? So nothing too sinister with the back of the head shots from Benn's part, one might argue. In a wild fight like that, it's more so on the referee to make sure that stuff doesn't happen, surely. If you're getting away with it as a fighter, but you're trying to get your way back into the fight and you're getting away with it, as I said, you're going off instincts, you're probably going to keep on doing it. So poor refereeing performance, you might have to put it down too. But now, here's where some people theorise that there was some really dirty business going on from the part of Nigel Benn that led to him doing so much damage to Gerald McLennan in there. So earlier we spoke about how Gerald McLennan was stretchered off and out of the ring after the fight. But meanwhile, Nigel Benn was buzzing after his big win. He had a couple of nice rowdy post-fight interviews, getting a bit snappy with Gary Newman on the interview for ITV. The same Gary Newman who was trying to help hold his head up when he was knocked through the ropes in round 1, funnily enough. And Benn was calling out Roy Jones Jr in his Showtime interview. But after McLennan was stretchered out of the ring, as Nigel Benn made his way out of the ring with the Essex boys, he collapsed right before he could make it backstage, speaking to just how brutal this fight was for both of the contestants. So Nigel Benn was in a lot of pain with the swollen jaw and everything, and he's gone on to say that he passed out due to exhaustion. However, this supposed loss of consciousness on the way out of the arena meant that he did not partake in a post-fight drugs test. Now many people believe it to be way too convenient that Benn managed to avoid this post-fight drugs test. Surely he was juiced up, right? And that's how he did so much damage in there, coupled with the illegal blows at the back of the head. And years later, Gerald McLennan's trainer of the time, Stan Johnson, claimed that there was blood on Gerald McLennan's boots that had traces of anabolic steroids on it. Now I'll be honest, in regards to the post-fight drugs test thing, it is understandable that people find it very suspect that Benn managed to avoid the test. But the real issue when it comes to the question of whether or not Nigel Benn was juicing for that fight is that nobody on the side of Gerald McLennan managed to make any real serious claim against Nigel Benn to have this investigated further. So that whole thing sort of goes unsolved. And the thing about the blood on the boot does sort of sound made up, to be honest. So all of that is theory and up for debate. But the first link to Conor Benn here in regards to all this tragedy stuff is that some people believe that Conor Benn being a PED user is a like father like son situation due to this Ben McLennan post-fight drugs test controversy. But that discussion deserves a video of its own, to be honest. Okay, so when alluding to the back of the head blows, I just mentioned that the referee in there is responsible for mediating such a thing. And he did indeed fall on referee Alfred Azaro as a result of the fight. But it wasn't just his lack of mediation of the rabbit punches that caused the backlash. There was also a lot of controversy about his supposed long count for that round 1 knockdown that Nigel Benn was on the receiving end of, thus giving Benn too much time to recover, and subsequently his constant breaking of that action for the remainder of that first round that slowed McLennan down in his pursuit of getting rid of Benn in that round was highly criticised. So pretty much, people reckon this ref did everything in his power to stop McLennan from getting the round 1 knockout win. And as for later on in the fight, the ref was also criticised by a good few people for not ending the fight sooner, as it was said that McLennan was showing signs of serious damage at the time that ought to have been identified by Azaro. But on the other hand, if a fighter is showing signs that they are not quite themselves in there, as Alfred Azaro himself pointed out, that's kind of on the corner to identify and pull their fighter out of there or throw the towel in. But the thing is, Gerald McLennan's trainer of the time, Stan Johnson, was not a very experienced or well regarded pro boxing trainer. Well, he was regarded, but yeah, if you know, you know. So there's not much else to the Stan Johnson thing other than the fact that he was just an incompetent trainer. So not only did he not really know what he was doing in regards to preparation for the fight and corner advice, but as the fight went on how it did, he is also very much criticised for not stopping the fight on behalf of his fighter. And there's actually a bit of finger pointing and blame shifting between referee Alfred Azaro and trainer Stan Johnson over who ought to have been stopping the fight. But one important thing that I should note about the trainer stuff is that Gerald McLennan was formerly under the guidance of legendary trainer Emmanuel Stewart, but McLennan sacked off Stewart to bring in Stan Johnson, which many people view as a grave mistake from McLennan. And Manny Stewart himself stated that he believes that the tragedy wouldn't have taken place if he were to be in McLennan's corner on the night of the Nigel Benn fight rather than Stan Johnson. But now look, here's the real controversial part, and this is the narrative that Gerald McLennan doesn't deserve any sympathy for the crippling state that he was left in due to his past. Now this past I speak of pertains to his involvement in animal abuse. I want to first remind all of you guys that Gerald McLennan was left blind, unable to walk, and basically mentally incompetent as a result of this boxing match. His quality of life was decreased to a huge extent. So one who believes in the sanctity of human life shouldn't wish this on anyone for their abuse of animal. But let's take a look at some of the things he reportedly did. So he was involved in pitbull fighting and was reportedly addicted to the spectacle of 2 dogs fighting to the death, which is obviously wrong and highly illegal, and does speak to him being some sort of wrong 'un. So this is something he did on a regular basis, and it is a violation of animal rights to the highest extent, especially given that he was involved with the breeding of dogs who are trained to kill. So again, dog fighting is obviously wrong, but it's understandable why it's a thing. Not that I'd ever partake in it, but you could see why one would get a thrill from gambling on such a thing, and it is said that McLennan would throw around tens of thousands of dollars betting on these dog fights. And also, excuse me if I'm not the most sensitive to this dog abuse issue here, because I personally never owned a dog or cared to do so, but with the extent that McLennan is said to have taken it at times, even those who don't really care for dogs much will think this is pretty messed up. So the main story of him taking it too far, well, I'm getting mixed reports of whether this was a one-time thing or a habitual thing or something he did a couple times or whatever, but it's bad either way. And this is a story that he would purchase a Labrador, tape its mouth shut, and watch his pet pitbull devour and kill it. Like, come on, at least give the poor thing a fighting chance. I mean, not that the outcome would have been so different if the Labrador didn't have its mouth taped shut, but yeah, that part just like, that's pretty messed up. That is pure torture there. And there are other wild stories out there about the brutal extent of his animal abuse. There's even a story about him running over flamingos for fun outside of a mall in Florida. So yes, many people believe that Gerald McLennan's life-altering injuries from the Nigel Benn fight is karma for his animal abuse. But these aren't just opinions held by people on the internet. No. Animal rights groups actually protested fundraising events in Gerald's honour, which just shows the extent to which this situation gets complicated. McLennan didn't have any of his World Championship money left when he was disabled, but due to his dogfighting past, actual animal rights groups tried to stop funds being raised for his care. Now you have to remember that a lot of these dogfighting stories aren't actually proven, and McLennan was never charged with any crimes relating to animal abuse. So even if you think McLennan deserved what happened to him, if all of those stories are indeed true, for organisations that are supposed to be charitable in nature actively trying to block fundraising for a disabled person when they are not actively running any investigations proving his guilt of these crimes, or haven't had any direct involvement with resolving animal abuse cases involving McLennan, is not really right, is it? But yeah, voices all over the internet are actually pleased with the state McLennan was left in due to the dog abuse. A former Eubank Jr opponent, he who shall not be named, has been very vocal on the matter, funnily enough. But some people's lack of sympathy for McLennan came from the fact that they just thought he was a bit scummy all round. Nigel Benn's former manager Peter De Freitas discussed his lack of sympathy to McLennan in an interview due to McLennan's cocky and disrespectful attitude, and insulted Nigel Benn's father in the build up to the fight, saying that he'd leave Nigel Benn in a wheelchair in the fight, then leave his dad in one after, which is painfully ironic. But on that note, that wasn't the only ironical eerie thing that McLennan said before the fight. So in April of 1994, British boxer Bradley Stone died as a result of injuries sustained in the ring, and there is a statue in memory of him in London. And according to Gerald McLennan's then trainer Stan Johnson, due to McLennan's competitive nature, a few days before the fight against Nigel Benn, in London of course, Gerald McLennan looked up at the statue of Bradley Stone and said that he'd rather go out like Bradley Stone than get knocked out, which is just insane. So yes, when it comes to McLennan, he was involved in a highly illegal and harmful form of degeneracy outside of the ring in the dogfighting, and he certainly had a mean streak in the ring as well. So the man just had a menacing personality about him all round, which makes him the bad guy, as opposed to the discussion of Nigel Benn being the drug cheating rabbit punching bad guy who gave another man lifelong injuries. Again, the Nigel Benn drug cheat stuff is all alleged. As much as people have the right to criticise Gerald McLennan's lifestyle, at least, as far as we know, his mean streak didn't carry into him harming other humans outside of the ring, unlike some other boxers in the past. And I'm saying that to clarify the fact that I'm definitely not here to incite any Gerald McLennan hate at all, but just covering all of the facts around this dark ordeal. And I also don't want to seem so much more sensitive to the injuries of Michael Watson than I am to McLennan's, especially given the fact that Watson ultimately made a better recovery. But it's only natural when there ain't a bad word about Michael Watson out there. And maybe there is a British bias here, as I've spoken to someone who knew Michael Watson personally, and they only have the best to say about Michael Watson, much like the British press do. Watson was also heralded as the people's champion after he lost that first fight to Eubank on the cards. So yeah, he was just a good guy and loved by the people all in all. So to reiterate that distinction between the Eubank-Watson situation and the Benn-McLennan situation, with the Benn-McLennan situation, there is a big argument out there that Nigel Benn is the bad guy and is clearly responsible for McLennan's injuries due to his unlawful tactics outside of the boxing rule set. And there is of course that argument that McLennan was a terrible person and deserved what happened to him. But no such discussions exist for either man in the Eubank-Watson situation, for right-minded people at least. But before I move on from Gerald McLennan, I must mention the resentment from Gerald McLennan's family towards Nigel Benn that lasted for 12 years until the two men finally met again. That resentment mainly came from Gerald's sister Lisa, publicly at least, who spoke about wanting Benn dead, seemingly due to Benn's disregard of the situation at the time, because after Benn came out of the hospital to be treated after the fight, the media asked him how he felt about Gerald McLennan, and Nigel Benn said, "Rather him than me." And this disregard from Nigel Benn continued on throughout the next few years due to the fast lifestyle that he was living back then. So the resentment from the McLennans made sense, but the peace was made years later when Nigel Benn found God. And another thing to mention about the family of Gerald McLennan, they actually went against doctor's orders and flew McLennan back from London to the USA too soon, which is believed by some to have worsened McLennan's permanent health issues. Now to move on to some of the backlash of the Nick Blackwell situation. So there was some tension from the side of Nick Blackwell towards the Eubanks after the fight, which is understandable as the guy's career got ended by Junior. But the thing here is that Eubank Sr and Junior held a press conference about the fight and the situation with Blackwell's injury, which Blackwell's family apparently begged the Eubanks not to do, and they still went and did it, and it was seen as a publicity stunt. And Blackwell was also troubled by the fact that Eubank Jr did not visit him in the hospital after the fight, and apparently went out partying instead, according to Blackwell. On top of this, Blackwell refutes the plaudits that Eubank Sr gets for being compassionate in his corner advice between the 8th and 9th round when he told Eubank Jr to go to the body rather than the head. Blackwell believes that was only a tactical thing, rather than a means of Eubank Sr looking out for Blackwell's health and safety. The Eubanks were in turn very taken aback by these claims from Blackwell. Another thing regarding the Nick Blackwell situation that links to the Gerald McClellan situation is Blackwell's own claims of coming into the fight with a head injury already. As for Michael Watson now, there is nothing on the record claiming that he was carrying any sort of injury going into the fight. But when it comes to Gerald McClellan, it is certainly believed that he would have been carrying some sort of head trauma going into the Benn fight. There is no specific story around that gets to the bottom of the matter, but it is believed that the power punches he took from Julian the Hawk Jackson, punches that McClellan's chin held up for, did in fact do some damage to the brain of McClellan, so maybe some concussions that he never recovered from properly. And it is also said that McClellan would complain about headaches from sparring as well. But with Nick Blackwell now, according to himself, there was a specific moment before the Eubank Jr fight that caused a bleed to the brain, that being a right hand that he took from George Groves in sparring that gave him headaches leading up to the Eubank Jr fight. Blackwell says that that's the hardest he'd ever been hit, so he was definitely coming out of that spar with George Groves with a concussion at least, but due to his passion and pride, he still went ahead with the Eubank Jr fight. And speaking of his passion and pride, this is also the same thing that left him permanently damaged when he of course decided to spar again after that Eubank Jr fight. And just more on that situation, as much as I do want to be sensitive to the boxer who dedicated his life to the sport being a victim of his own pride, it was his choice to get in there and spar after being lucky to survive the Eubank Jr fight without even needing surgery. But in choosing to spar, those involved with the spar were punished for the matter. The man who he sparred, Hassan Karkadi, was met with a 6-month suspension by the British Boxing Board of Control, thus cancelling his then upcoming fight. And Karkadi's trainer who oversaw the spar, Liam Wilkins, had his trainer's licence banned for life by the British Boxing Board of Control, a ban which Wilkins appealed. Involving in this spar with a brain damaged individual was of course very wrong from the part of Karkadi and Wilkins, but apparently Hassan Karkadi was unaware of who Nick Blackwell even was. And those boxing fans who gave Karkadi the benefit of the doubt and believe this to be true, reckon that the British Boxing Board of Control suspended Karkadi to make an example and have someone to blame for Nick Blackwell's life-threatening second brain injury, which in turn might cover their own tracks a bit in their licensing of Blackwell's involvement in boxing again via that British Boxing Board of Control trainer's licence. Now that would be very unfortunate for Hassan Karkadi if it were indeed true, but if you read up on Karkadi, you might think that he's not the nicest bloke in the world, to be honest. And interestingly, despite Karkadi's British Boxing Board of Control suspension reportedly lasting only 6 months, he would never box again after this suspension. And coincidentally, his last 2 fights as a pro, that being his last 2 fights before the Blackwell spar, were both against Scott Westgarth. Scott Westgarth, who went on to pass away due to injuries caused in the ring in 2018. And the aforementioned Eubank Jr opponent, who is very vocal about his dislike of Gerald McClellan, also made an offensive tweet about Scott Westgarth shortly after Westgarth's passing, and this, along with comments about McClellan, meant his British Boxing Board of Control licence was suspended, thus cancelling a then upcoming fight, and he never boxed again after the ban, just like Hassan Karkadi. So that's kinda mad, ain't it? I might do a video on that former Eubank Jr opponent in the future, but let me not get too off track here. And back to Nick Blackwell, he has been seen in multiple public appearances with Michael Watson in touching scenes, the 2 men who are miraculously still alive after their respective fights with the Eubanks, showing just how far they've come in their brave roads to recovery. But aside from all of those involved with the in-ring tragedies in those Eubank and Benn fights, let's take a look into some of the tragedies that have taken place within the Eubank and Benn families themselves. So in 2021, as most of you will know, Chris Eubank Jr.'s younger brother Sebastian passed away at the age of 29. 29. He was a bloody kid. Sebastian was only a couple of years younger than Chris, and they have the same mother and father, so they would have been very close growing up. Sebastian lost his life to a massive heart attack while in Dubai in July of 2021, tragically leaving behind a widow and a 1-month-old baby boy. As a result of this, Chris Eubank Jr. vowed to take care of Sebastian's young son Raheem and has taken on the role of father figure and provider in the young man's life. Another thing on Sebastian Eubank's death, it's obviously very hard to lose a child. It's against the natural order of things, so of course this loss was very hard for Eubank Sr. to deal with, and boxing fans pointed out at the time the damning impact this tragic death had on Eubank Sr.'s mental health. Again, very understandably so. And as for the Eubank family tree, Chris Eubank Sr. has, or had, twin brothers, who are twins of each other, not himself, that being Simon and Peter Eubank. Both Simon and Peter Eubank were pro boxers too, but with more of a journeyman type career, Well, Peter Eubank actually held wins over Barry McGuigan and Joe Frazier Jr., which is decent, but he did end his career on a losing record and never boxed for a title, much like his brother Simon. And in 2023 now, it was brother Simon Eubank who tragically passed away at the age of just 61 after his long battle with dementia. So another very tragic loss for the Eubank family there. Simon Eubank is actually the father of Harlem Eubank, who is of course also currently an acclaimed professional boxer who has a record of 21-0 now. And he actually just fought Tyrone McKenna the other day, got the round 10 stoppage victory in that one. So it would have been a very tough time for Harlem Eubank losing his father in 2023, only a couple of years after losing his cousin. And hard for Eubank Sr. as well, losing his brother within such short succession of losing his son. So yeah, a tough time for the Eubanks all round. To look at the Benn side of things now. So Chris Eubank Jr. of course had the damning experience of losing a brother at way too young of an age. And Nigel Benn shares this experience too, but he was way younger at the time. When Nigel Benn was only 8 years old, his eldest brother was killed at the young age of 17. He was brutally murdered by racists by being pushed through a window. Nigel Benn opened up on the Simon Jordan podcast about how traumatic this was to deal with as a young man and how it shaped his troubled childhood, and how that led to him joining the army and everything, and subsequently how this childhood trauma and how that destruction of his young family life carried into his wild personality in his boxing days, facing issues such as drug addictions. So yeah, facing such a tragic family death so young can really change somebody as a person. So that was hefty, weren't it? There really were a lot of upsetting tragedies involving the Eubanks and the Benns in and out of the ring. But now let's take a look at more current family matters involving Chris Eubank Jr. and Conor Benn. And don't worry, I'm not going to be prying on their home lives or anything too much. Most of this will be boxing related. So a good place to start is Chris Eubank Sr. pushing for his nephew Harlem Eubank to get the Conor Benn fight over his son Chris Eubank Jr. So there is of course a lot to get into with this one. So Eubank Sr. started being by the side of Harlem Eubank and taking this managerial role in his nephew's career in the back end of 2023. This was the time of Harlem's fight against Timo Schwarzkopf, and after Harlem's stoppage victory in that fight, Chris Sr. was doing interviews alongside Harlem, hyping up his nephew's boxing career and pushing for big fights on his behalf. And Chris Sr. has spoken in interviews about the passing of Harlem's father Simon being incentive for him to look out for his nephew, which is obviously a very good thing. And shades of Eubank Jr. looking out for his young infant nephew after the passing of his brother. And the similarities there just further signifies all the Eubank family went through around that time. And as Chris Sr. is of course looking out for Harlem in a boxing sense, this is great promotion for Harlem's career. And he probably had more eyes on him than ever with his uncle by his side at that point in 2023. So this can only be a positive, surely. And as for Chris Sr. pushing for the Conor Benn fight for Harlem Eubank rather than his own son Chris Jr., well, on the surface, this seems like a way to throw his son under the bus, because Chris Eubank Jr. versus Conor Benn was the fight that the general public wanted, right? And the fight that people have been waiting to get signed again after the cancellation in 2022. But the fight between the sons of Chris Eubank and Nigel Benn has been widely criticised as a gimmick fight due to the weight difference, with Conor Benn being a 147-pound fighter, as in a welterweight, and Chris Eubank Jr. being a 160-pound fighter, as in a middleweight, but is actually a former super middleweight, the 168-pound division. So major compromises would have to be made for one of, if not both of the two fighters in terms of weight, and they'll be putting aside title pursuits in their respective weight classes for this gimmick fight, just because their fathers fought each other back in the day. And yes, Eubank Jr. did make a major compromise weight-wise for the original scheduled Conor Benn fight, boiling himself down to the 157-pound catch weight, just for the fight to be cancelled due to Conor Benn's drug test failure. And Eubank Sr. has expressed in many interviews that he was not very happy at all with the dangers of these weight compromises. And he claims that he stopped the original scheduled fight in 2022 from happening, despite the actual reason, again, being Conor Benn's drug test failure. More on the side of Eubank Jr. now. Between when that fight with Conor Benn originally got cancelled and its recent rescheduling for April of this year, it was Conor Benn clamouring for that fight with Eubank Jr. amidst his drug scandal and all that. But as I've said in a previous video, Eubank Jr. just went back to doing his thing at 160 as he likely would have otherwise. So Eubank Jr. was not so consumed by the Conor Benn fight and did seem kinda happy to move on. So it's not as if Eubank Sr. is taking something away from Eubank Jr. by saying that Harlem Eubank should get the Conor Benn fight instead. He is concerned about the weight issues. Eubank Jr. wasn't prioritising the Conor Benn fight anyway, and most of all, yes, Harlem Eubank is a campaigning welterweight. Well, he has fluctuated between welter and junior welterweight, but You get the point. Harlem is way more in the vicinity of Conor Benn weight-wise than Chris Jr, and he is now the IBF Intercontinental Champ at welterweight. So Harlem Eubank vs Conor Benn will still be Eubank vs Benn, and it may not have the same casual appeal as the fight with the two sons, but it does more for both men in terms of world title shot implications in the welterweight division. The division that Conor Benn has expressed his desires to pursue gold in either way after the Eubank Jr fight, win or lose, further proving that one to be a gimmick fight. And then Eubank Jr can go for big fights at 160 or 168, right? But you see, the thing is, it's not all that plain and simple. Chris Eubank Jr and Chris Eubank Sr haven't had the best relationship in the last few years. Chris Eubank Sr had revealed in an interview earlier last year that Jr didn't want him as his manager anymore. So Eubank Sr said that he therefore can't be by his side if he can't be the boss of his son. And a few months ago, Jr admitted in an interview that he and his father don't have much of a relationship anymore, but Jr wants him back in his life. But Jr also confirmed in that same interview a few months back that he is his own man and doesn't want his dad too involved with him on a business side of things, but still does want a relationship with him. But seemingly, Eubank Sr looks to want nothing to do with his son if he can't be in charge of his boxing career. And in regards to Eubank Sr pushing for Harlem Eubank to get the Conor Benn fight over Eubank Jr, well, to be honest, when campaigning for that Harlem Eubank vs Conor Benn fight, Chris Sr has been throwing his son Jr under the bus a bit. He is rejecting the fight that will make his son a whole lot of money, and he has been publicly talking down his son's career, criticising his career choices, to be fighting a welterweight in Conor Benn rather than fight the likes of Canelo or Billy Joe Saunders in a rematch, just expressing his all-round displeasure with his son's career trajectory. But just on Harlem Eubank and where he's at right now, yes, as aforementioned, he just won a fight against Tyrone McKenna. He really beat McKenna up and then dropped him a couple of times to ultimately stop the game Irish opponent in the 10th. And yes, Eubank Sr was by the side of Harlem in his walkout with the old sheriff badge on. And right after Harlem gained the stoppage victory, he walked up to the camera to call out Conor Benn. So yes, as it currently stands, this Harlem Eubank vs Conor Benn stuff is still a thing. And as I said before, Harlem Eubank actually won the IBF Intercontinental welterweight title in that victory. And in the post-fight interview, alongside Chris Sr, he referenced how Sr has been saying to him that the Conor Benn vs Chris Eubank Jr fight won't happen. So Harlem said he will be ready to step in. And of course Chris Sr continued to express the same sentiment right afterwards, really rallying for the Harlem Eubank vs Conor Benn fight while Conor is scheduled to fight his son. But aside from all the family stuff, it was a great performance from Harlem Eubank, and he does have the potential to make an impact on the welterweight world title scene. And now, all of this stuff between Chris Sr and Chris Jr is ironic because in the face-off for the original scheduled Conor Benn vs Chris Eubank Jr fight in 2022, Conor Benn was talking about the dichotomy of Chris Eubank Sr holding the hand of Jr throughout his rise in professional boxing, as opposed to Nigel Benn sort of letting Conor Benn be his own man. You know, Nigel Benn wasn't in Conor's corner all of the time or anything. But now, Chris Eubank Jr and Sr have no relationship at all, and Sr hasn't been by the side of Jr at any point in the build-up to this Conor Benn fight so far. But Nigel Benn has been by the side of Conor. Conor Benn pointed this out at the launch press conference, insulting Eubank Jr for his own dad not liking him. The same press conference that ended with Eubank Jr slapping an egg on Conor Benn's face, and then Nigel Benn throttling Eubank Jr. And subsequently, in the second launch presser, Eubank Jr threatened Nigel Benn, which enraged Conor Benn. And Conor Benn lashed out and pointed out Eubank Jr.'s threats as being down to jealousy. Eubank Jr.'s jealousy of his own dad not liking him and not being there for him. And this time around, the face-off for the Eubank Jr vs Conor Benn fight was a one-man face-off, because of the egg slap of course. The two men can't get close to each other, just in case they put the fight in jeopardy. And Conor Benn spoke in that one about how sad it is that Chris Eubank Jr and Sr no longer have a relationship. And Conor Benn then contrasted this to the strong relationship that him and his dad Nigel have, and Nigel being proud of him no matter what. And just to nod back to the past here, Chris Eubank Jr enraging Conor Benn by trash talking his dad Nigel at the press conference is actually shades of Gerald McLennan being disrespectful to Nigel's father at their press conference back in the day. An incident that I've heard a reference in a couple of interviews, including Nigel's own, but I can't seem to find footage of that presser for the life of me. Alright, but to chime in with some opinion here, my content isn't really some fully impartial documentary type stuff. Of course, a dad should be proud of his son and all that, and publicly expressing your dismay with your son's career because you can't be in charge of it is petty. You could argue that Chris Eubank Sr should be having these conversations with his son behind closed doors. But if you do listen to the stuff Eubank Sr says about Jr in his interviews and on his own channel, Call Chris Eubank, he is pretty much right with everything he is saying, and he seems to want the biggest and best fights for his son so he can actually go for greatness. And his criticism of his son's career choices are all justified as well, such as calling him out for trying to box like Roy Jones Jr, which got him knocked out in that first Liam Smith fight, fighting with his hands down and staying in the corner for too long and all that. So yeah, whatever your opinions are on somebody publicly critiquing their own son so hard, do go listen to Cool Chris Eubank and tell me one thing that he says wrong. Again, regardless of how petty you perceive him to be coming across. But on the other hand, just to consider every side of the argument here, which is why my videos end up so long, and speaking of Roy Jones Jr, you could also say that Eubank Sr never fought Michael Nunn or James Toney or Roy Jones Jr or any of those cats over in the States. So yeah, you could say that his public criticism of his own son is down to jealousy. Alright, now to move on to the history of the parts that the promoters have had to play in the Benn-Eubank rivalry. So back when Nigel Benn and Chris Eubank Sr were fighting, the two men involved in each man's career and their rivalry with each other were Frank Warren and Barry Hearn. Both men had worked with both promoters in their respective careers. But because promoters didn't take the forefront back then as much as they do now for the most part, it is hard to identify exactly when both Nigel Benn and Chris Eubank were represented or not represented by Barry Hearn or Frank Warren throughout their respective careers. But it is a pretty known fact that Chris Eubank was mainly represented by Barry Hearn. Barry Hearn promoted Eubank throughout his heyday, and the two men were actually very close, with Barry Hearn being Chris Eubank's best man at his wedding in 1990, so they were very close indeed. And apparently Barry Hearn's wife was the one who chose Eubank's iconic walkout music, Simply the Best, by Tina Turner. And as for Nigel Benn, well, he was originally represented by Frank Warren early in his career. Started his career with Warren in fact. But you know when Frank Warren conveniently got shot and put out of action for a bit, and then a few of his fighters jumped ship to be promoted by Barry Hearn, but a few of those fighters went back to Frank Warren afterwards? Well, seeing as Nigel Benn was promoted by Frank Warren early in his career, then went on to be promoted by Barry Hearn, then went back to Frank Warren after that, it would be easy to sensationalise all of this and go by the narrative that Nigel Benn jumped ship to Barry Hearn after Frank Warren got shot, right? But Frank Warren got shot in November of 1989, and Nigel Benn split with Frank Warren around the middle of 1988 due to some sort of financial dispute, and he didn't even go straight on to be promoted by Barry Hearn after leaving Frank Warren. But when Nigel Benn subsequently left Barry Hearn in later years, he did then jump ship straight to his old promoter Frank Warren. And the story on that is a little good one, and directly links to the Benn-Eubank rivalry. So this story is regarding the rematch between Nigel Benn and Chris Eubank in October of 1993. And this is as told by Nigel Benn's manager of the time, Peter De Freitas, and he spoke on this affair in an interview on Liam Galvin's channel, so I'll do the honour of linking that in the description for those who want to hear the whole interview. So basically, Benn vs Eubank 2 was a super middleweight unification fight, with Benn being the WBC World Champion and Eubank being the WBO World Champion, and both Benn and Eubank were represented by Barry Hearn then. But of course, Eubank was Barry Hearn's boy. So just a day before the fight, Benn's manager Peter De Freitas got word that Barry Hearn did not sign the WBO sanctioning fees for this Benn vs Eubank fight, meaning that this would technically only be a unification fight for Chris Eubank. He was challenging for Benn's WBC title, but Nigel Benn was not challenging for Eubank's WBO belt, unbeknownst to Benn. This would mean that in case of a Nigel Benn win, Eubank would be stripped of his WBO belt for losing, despite the belt not being on the line, but he would then be able to challenge for the vacant WBO title right away afterwards. Bit of a mad move from Barry Hearn there. So Peter De Freitas was of course not very happy with this, and was ready to cancel the fight just a day out. But he carried out his managerial duties and made sure that the sanctioning fees for the WBO belt was paid. So this was now a real unification fight. Benn had his shot at the WBO belt. So on fight night, Barry Hearn was about to walk out both Eubank and Benn as he represented both men. But before the ring walks, Barry Hearn quickly told Peter De Freitas that he was going to go walk Chris Eubank out first, as Eubank was to be walking out first, and then he would come back to get Benn for his walkout afterwards. But De Freitas told Barry Hearn, "No you're not, Frank Warren is going to walk Nigel Benn out, and we're doing business with him now, you're sacked." And Barry Hearn asked De Freitas, why? And De Freitas then told Barry that he knew what he did with the WBO belt, and just like that, Nigel Benn was no longer a Barry Hearn fighter. Eubank would walk out with Barry Hearn, and Benn would walk out with Frank Warren. Now, in principle, what Barry Hearn was trying to do to Nigel Benn there was quite snidey, but ironically, none of this stuff with the belts would even matter in the end, for Chris Eubank and Nigel Benn fought to a 12-round draw, so both men kept their respective title belts anyway. And on an aside here, the magnitude of Barry Hearn's antics here aren't as serious as it would be in a proper unification fight. So why wasn't Ben Eubank 2 a proper unification fight then? Well, as many of you may know, the WBO belt was not recognised as a major world title back then, and didn't even go on to be until over a decade later. Now, I thought I should note that for those of you who didn't know. But not long after this fight, Nigel Benn and his manager Peter De Freitas would meet up with Frank Warren to sign a deal with him, and Nigel Benn then remained to be a Frank Warren fighter for the rest of his boxing career. And speaking of ending his career as a Frank Warren fighter, although Eubank was Barry Hearn's boy, he ended his career fighting on Frank Warren's shows, but he wasn't a Frank Warren fighter per se. And in interviews, Frank Warren has briefly touched on Chris Eubank not being happy with being a Barry Hearn fighter back then. So there was clearly some sort of financial dispute between Chris Eubank and Barry Hearn behind the scenes in the latter years of Eubank's career, which is sad because Eubank was so close to Hearn's family and Hearn was his best man at the wedding and all that. But Eubank will be remembered as a Barry Hearn fighter, and it's fair to say that after his fighting days, he was indeed on better terms with Barry Hearn than he was Frank Warren. Now to move on to who the sons of Nigel Benn and Chris Eubank are promoted by. So going into this rescheduled Chris Eubank Jr vs Conor Benn fight, Chris Eubank Jr.'s promoter is one Ben Shalom. And as for Conor Benn's promoter, enter the son of Chris Eubank Sr.'s old promoter Barry Hearn, Eddie Hearn. Now Ben Shalom has only entered the fray of the Ben Eubank rivalry in this latest chapter of the story in 2025, as when Conor Benn and Chris Eubank Jr. were supposed to fight back in 2022, Chris Eubank Jr. was then promoted by the Sauerland brothers. But as for Eddie Hearn, he was of course Conor Benn's promoter back when this fight was first meant to happen, and has been Conor Benn's promoter for like 9 years now, since the start of Conor Benn's career, and Conor's his boy. That's why Eddie Hearn backed Conor Benn so hard amidst this doping scandal in the last couple of years. So much like Chris Eubank Sr. was Barry Hearn's boy, Conor Benn is Eddie Hearn's boy. So the Hearn is on the other side of the Eubank-Benn rivalry this time around. So yeah, Eddie Hearn is on opposite sides of Chris Eubank Jr., despite Eubank Jr.'s father formerly being such a close family friend of the Hearns. Eddie's dad was the best man at Eubank Jr.'s dad's wedding. And by the way, as aforementioned, the promoters are in our faces as boxing fans quite a bit in this modern era. So the rivalry has spilled over to where each fighter is beefing the rival promoter. And at the first launch press conference for this new rescheduled Ben vs Eubank fight, Chris Eubank Jr. started out by absolutely owning Eddie Hearn, just completely shutting him down. I'm sure most of you have seen that presser, and if not, I do suggest you go and watch it to see Eddie Hearn get absolutely rattled. But with the stipulations surrounding this fight, the promotional beef does go quite deep. As last time around, Chris Eubank Jr. boiled himself down to the 157-pound catchweight limit, a stipulation put in place by Eddie Hearn to compensate for Conor Benn's size disadvantage against Eubank. But many people, especially Chris Eubank Sr., deemed Chris Eubank Jr.'s weight loss for that fight to be dangerous to his overall health. And after the Ben vs Eubank fight was cancelled in 2022, Eubank Jr. jumped straight back into training camp to move on to the Liam Smith fight. And many people do attribute Eubank Jr.'s knockout loss in that fight to the fact that he jumped straight back into camp so depleted. Now, that was the first time Eubank Jr. and Conor Benn were supposed to fight, but of course Eddie Hearn has put another weight stipulation in this time around, that being the 10-pound rehydration clause for Eubank Jr. And this one has got everyone talking. People are calling this one very dangerous as well, and again, especially Chris Eubank Sr. So yes, it really is personal between Eddie Hearn and Chris Eubank Jr. here. And as for Eubank Jr.'s promoter Ben Shalom, well, there's a bit of beef brewing between him and Eddie Hearn, but I won't go into that too much as it's not fully relevant to the Ben vs Eubank stuff. But at the presser, Ben Shalom and Eddie Hearn were going back and forth arguing about clauses and the split of the fight person stuff. And Eddie Hearn was claiming the one-upsmanship in getting Eubank Jr. and Ben Shalom to sign for the rehydration clause. Plus there has been some static between Ben Shalom and Conor Benn as well, arguing about who's making more money and stuff. And we saw Conor Benn getting Ben Shalom shook at the stadium face-off, which was hilarious. But now here's where things get real interesting. This is the thing that solidifies this whole thing as a family affair. If the whole dichotomy between Chris Eubank Sr.'s relationship with Barry Hearn and Chris Eubank Jr.'s relationship, or lack thereof, with Eddie Hearn wasn't enough. So the promotion that Eddie Hearn runs is Matchroom Boxing, which was founded by his father Barry Hearn. Well, the Matchroom sport conglomerate as a whole was founded by Barry Hearn, of course. But Eddie Hearn doesn't run Matchroom Boxing alone, of course. He runs it alongside Frank Smith, his apprentice, who is the CEO of Matchroom Boxing. And it just so happens that Frank Smith's missus, his girlfriend, his fiancée, or whatever you like, is one Emily Eubank, the sister of Chris Eubank Jr., and needless to say, the daughter of Chris Eubank Sr. And Frank Smith and Emily Eubank have been romantically involved for years now, dating back to 2016. But Frank Smith was an official employee of Matchroom Boxing since 2011, so Matchroom did come first for Frank Smith, if that's worth anything. So this is a bit wild, of course, and I don't want to paint anyone out in a bad light here, because Emily Eubank and Frank Smith were together long before Conor Benn vs Chris Eubank Jr. was really a thing. But with how personal the rivalry is, with all the weight clauses and petty financial disputes, and contractual proceedings that I'm sure Frank Smith has played a major hand in behind the scenes, it is a bit mental that the man who Emily Eubank goes to bed with at night is a man working for the promotional company that is going against her brother, so to speak. In this chapter of the Benn vs Eubank feud, Matchroom Boxing are indeed a collective antagonist in Eubank Jr.'s life. So from Eubank Jr.'s perspective, you've got him beefing Eddie Hearn in this Conor Benn rivalry, but Eddie Hearn's father formerly shared a close bond with his father Chris Sr., and the CEO of Eddie Hearn's promotional company is dating his sister. If that doesn't make Conor Benn vs Chris Eubank Jr. a family affair, then I don't know what does. And I know that Conor Benn isn't directly involved in any of that, but he has been a Matchroom fighter his whole career. And as this rivalry brews, again, it is sort of Chris Eubank Jr. versus Matchroom as a whole. And just to bring this back to Barry Hearn and Chris Eubank Sr., in an IFL TV interview with Chris Eubank Sr. last year, the same interview in which he was talking about his split with Junior, he also touched on how he built Matchroom Boxing and the Matchroom sport conglomerate as a whole to the size that it is today, as he got Barry Hearn's Matchroom Boxing on Sky Sports in 1994 with an 8-fight deal that he signed. And this 8-fight deal that Chris Eubank Sr. signed allowed Barry Hearn to branch out into platforming darts and his other sports under the Matchroom conglomerate on Sky Sports. So Chris Eubank takes credit for the growth of Matchroom sport, and to be fair, Chris Eubank was the biggest star who Barry Hearn promoted, so this isn't such a far-fetched claim. And Chris Eubank said in that interview that he once said to his daughter Emily, "Your boyfriend wouldn't have a job if it wasn't for what I did for Matchroom," which is pretty hard, I must say. But speaking of Chris Eubank Jr.'s siblings, his 3 full siblings that he grew up with include his dearly departed younger brother Sebastian Eubank, who he mentioned earlier, his younger sister who we just spoke about, Emily Eubank, and his youngest sibling, his younger brother Joseph Eubank. Now, Sebastian Eubank was in the public eye due to his attempt at a professional boxing career, going 2-0 as a pro against journeyman, before his tragic and untimely death. And of course, Emily Eubank is a figure in the boxing public, for she is the girlfriend of the CEO of Matchroom Boxing, Frank Smith, and she can be seen sat beside Frank Smith and Eddie Hearn at Matchroom shows. But Joseph Eubank, he doesn't have any involvement in boxing and isn't much of a public figure at all. But as a member of the Eubank family, his name is of course known. But unfortunately, if you look up Joseph Eubank, he's been in the news for all of the wrong reasons. And I'm not about to try and paint him out in a bad light, but not much else is known about the guy other than bad things if you search the man's name up on Google, unfortunately. So in 2022, he was in the news for driving under the influence of cannabis, an incident that took place in 2021. And Joseph Eubank... Wait, sorry, I just realised, do you think I can even say that cannabis on YouTube? Probably not, but charge it. Okay, back to it. And Joseph Eubank was presented to us by the Sun newspaper as Chris Eubank's unemployed son, who had to rely on family help to pay for his drug driving offence. Ouch. Then in 2023, he got charged with 2 counts of a crime that I'm not even going to dare say the name of, not even with the G in front, you know, the name of the fruit, because I've been shadow banned in the past even for saying that ridiculous censored version. It was a really good video I did a few months ago in which I analysed every Mike Tyson fight that went the distance, but I briefly mentioned the name of the crime that Mike Tyson was arrested for later in that video, with the G in front, and still got shadow banned, badly. So link will be in description down below for that one. But back to Joseph Eubank. So this incident took place in July of 2022, literally a few weeks after his trial for the drug driving. And the then 26-year-old Joseph Eubank allegedly approached an intoxicated 16-year-old woman and started to talk with her, then brought her to a dark secluded beach where he would begin his sexual advances with her, and allegedly forced her into oral and penetrative intercourse. I don't know if I can say that on YouTube, but you know what? I'm just going to post this. Like, I will find out. I guess I'm going to find out, right? Now, Joseph Eubank pled not guilty in this case. He admitted to the sexual activity, but claimed it to be consensual. And just to note, the age of the consent in the UK is indeed 16 years old. Now, in September of 2024, Joseph Eubank was ultimately found not guilty. But of course, being arrested of such a crime is not a good look at all. And Joseph Eubank will now only be seen as one thing in the public eye for the most part. Another rough one for the Eubank family there. And it all came within that tragic 2-year period in which Sebastian and Simon Eubank both tragically passed away. Oh, and just back to Joseph Eubank's driving under the influence. Joseph isn't the only relatively unknown brother of a fighting Eubank who has only been in the news for wrong reasons. Harlem Eubank has an older brother, Luke, who was in the news for being charged for driving under the influence in 2021. Driving into a row of parked cars while speeding in his Range Rover, while being drunk, and was then found with cannabis in his pocket by the police. And in this article I'm reading, the then 35-year-old Luke Eubank is described as the jobless Eubank, much like Joseph Eubank was described. Imagine not having a job, man. I've got a job, obviously. And after this incident, Luke was banned from driving for 3 years and had to pay a fine and had to go to rehab and all that. Wow, the Eubanks and driving incidents, mate. And I'm just reading a bunch of other stuff now on Luke Eubank. What? This guy was in the news since 2013 for criminal offences. Back then he was charged with the battery of a woman, using violence to enter a property, and making threats to kill. Again, I don't know if I can say that word, but I'm taking a gamble even doing this video, if the stuff about dogs getting their mouth taped shut earlier wasn't enough. And Luke Eubank was in the news as recently as December 2024 for verbally abusing police officers after being arrested on suspicion on the battery of a woman. Now I ain't gonna lie, in planning this video out, I had planned to talk about all the stuff I've said so far, even the Joseph Eubank stuff. I was intending to talk about him beforehand, but I'll be honest, I only found out about this Luke Eubank just now, after being quite far into working on this video already, but I had to add it in because it is relevant. So the intention here is not to dig up dirt on every Eubank there is, but guess what? While briefly reading up on Luke Eubank, the son of Simon, I've stumbled across another Eubank who has also only been in the news for the wrong reasons. So this is Freedom Eubank. I'm going to assume this is the son of Peter Eubank here, as he is described as Chris Eubank's nephew, and he was jailed for being in a high-speed police chase. Mate, these driving stories. And he didn't even show up to court for the reason as you can see on screen. And I'm seeing way more about the criminal past of both Luke and Freedom, but we'll be here all day at this point. You know, I'm getting a bit off topic to the Ben Eubank rivalry and just going on a tirade about all this Eubank stuff that I'm just finding out now. Oh my days, give me a break. And I'm literally seeing a bunch of things about Freedom Eubank's father, Peter Eubank, being in trouble with the law now. A bunch of things dating back to the 90s and spanning to very recently. And these Peter Eubank stories are really weird, including the 2017 story of the then 54-year-old Peter Eubank going to court after being charged with theft, as in the theft of an iPhone charger in Sainsbury's, and he apparently attacked a photographer at his court appearance. Yeah, that stuff I just added in now was all impromptu. Watch though, I'm going to find out about some other Eubank after this video goes up. But I was going to say, I guess Harlem Eubank is the only good egg of the male surviving Eubanks. But I went to search up to confirm that fact, and it turns out he was involved in the driving offence as well. But nothing too dangerous here by the looks of it, but still. And speaking of egg, I guess Eubank Jr has done nothing wrong to be fair, apart from facing a £100,000 fine for slapping an egg in Conor Benn's face. But I don't think he's gone down in anyone's estimations as a result of that. It's probably had quite the opposite effect. But yeah, enough of the Eubanks being fined and arrested now. That was some trip. Oh, wait. Also, I've just found out that Chris Eubank Sr ended a man's life in a car accident in February of 1992, as opposed to August, the date I said earlier in the video. So this was in very short succession of the Michael Watson fight then, the second fight. Okay, but when it comes to siblings now, this obviously happens to be another topic where there is quite a bit more to talk about on the Eubank side of things. But as for the full siblings of Conor Benn, well, he does actually have a twin sister in India, Ben, but she doesn't really have any involvement with what I'm talking about today. Unlike Chris Eubank's sister, who is right in the thick of things as the missus of the CEO of Matchroom Boxing, India Ben ain't involved in this boxing talk. But there is one minor link I can make with her and something I talked about earlier. So on the night that Nigel Benn's old pal Ray Sullivan was attacked at the Legends nightclub in September of '96, of course Nigel was accused as the attacker of Sullivan but was ultimately found innocent. But he was present in that nightclub on the night. Now, according to Nigel, he was at the nightclub to celebrate the birth of his twins, Conor and India. And the night of the attack, the night that he was in that very nightclub, was indeed the date of birth of Conor and India. So basically, Nigel Benn was really in the thick of it in terms of controversies, right at the point of Conor Benn and India Benn's birth. So Nigel Benn and Chris Eubank have had a lot of similarities all round with the controversy surrounding their lives. The two rivals' lives are intertwined in so many ways, but they also have many similarities in their respective lives, unique things that they both happen to have in common, including the fact that they both gave an opponent severe brain damage and lifelong injuries in the ring. But speaking of the siblings of Conor Benn and Chris Eubank Jr., so I was speaking about their full siblings just now, but there's another major thing that Chris Eubank Sr. and Nigel Benn have in common, and some of you may know what I'm talking about, plus some of you may be able to make an educated guess based on the picture I have on screen. But seeing as we're getting on long, I'm going to give that topic its own video, and we'll think of that as the part 2 of the family affair that is Conor Benn vs Chris Eubank Jr. So that was a bit of a hefty one today. Touched on a lot of dark and sensitive topics in this one. And there's a way I want to link all of this stuff about the tragedies together ahead of this Conor Benn vs Chris Eubank Jr. fight. Now I mentioned earlier how Chris Eubank Sr., Chris Eubank Jr. and Nigel Benn have all done lifelong damage on an opponent in the ring. Eubank Sr. to Michael Watson, Nigel Benn to Gerald McLennan, and Eubank Jr. to Nick Blackwell. But Conor Benn hasn't done any permanent damage to an opponent yet, but he is widely believed to be a drug cheat, which is so shunned upon in boxing due to the dangers it can cause to the opponent. And of course many out there believe that Nigel Benn was on PEDs when he fought Gerald McLennan, hence McLennan's injuries as a result of that fight. And when it comes to the rehydration clause that Chris Eubank Jr. will have to abide by in this fight with Conor Benn, many ex-fighters are highly critical of this due to the dangers of not fully rehydrating from a weight cut. It makes your brain much more prone to damage. And a lot of boxing tragedies in the past have been to do with weight. And as I've mentioned multiple times, at the forefront of these criticisms is Chris Eubank Jr.'s own father, who is completely rejecting this upcoming fight in eerie fashion. This time around, Eubank Sr. is worried about the well-being of his own son, but if you do believe that Eubank Sr.'s advice to Jr. between the 8th and 9th round in that Nick Blackwell fight was out of compassion to Nick Blackwell, then the last time Eubank Sr. was worried for the health of a fighter in a fight involving his son, that fighter did go on to be damaged badly. Eubank Sr. seems to have a knack for identifying such a thing as a result of the Michael Watson incident. And on Michael Watson, that Eubank vs Watson 2 fight, which left Watson fighting for his life, was in White Hart Lane, as I mentioned earlier, the old Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. And Conor Benn vs Chris Eubank Jr. will take place in the new Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. It's quite crazy the way all of that comes together. If you do believe that Conor Benn still has it in him to be a drug cheat, then this fight coming up could be very dangerous. A juiced up fighter going against a weight drained fighter. And back to Nigel Benn vs Gerald McLennan, many out there also attribute the damage that Gerald McLennan took in there due to McLennan being underweight, but that's a bit different. He officially weighed 3 pounds under the limit as he wasn't an actual super middleweight, but still. So yeah, God forbid either Conor Benn or Chris Eubank Jr. get permanently damaged in their upcoming fight with each other, but with all the things I just said, it really would be a full circle moment of the dark tragedies surrounding the Eubank and Benn families. With all of those things with the weight depletion, Conor Benn's alleged doping, and the superstitious element of Conor Benn being yet to give someone brain damage, and the fight being in Tottenham Hotspur Stadium, where Eubank Jr.'s father gave Michael Watson brain damage, the first of the incidents that we spoke about today. All of that does sort of foreshadow Conor Benn hurting Chris Eubank Jr. really badly in there. But I'm not too superstitious, so I don't think it will happen because the writing is on the wall, but the dangers of the weight depletion stuff definitely can't be denied. But with the way the styles match up, and with Eubank Jr. being the naturally bigger guy, it wouldn't be too far-fetched to predict Eubank Jr. to inflict the type of beating on Conor Benn that he did Nick Blackwell, and go on to crack Conor Benn's skull and leave him effed up in a wheelchair, as Chris Eubank Jr.'s own manager might put it. But that's probably way too obscure of a reference there. I do go too obscure with the references sometimes. But again, God forbid either one of the two men gives the other any life-threatening injuries in there. Alright, let me finally end this one now. Now this is my second video in this sort of Benn Eubank series I'm doing ahead of the fight on April 26th. The first video was a sort of analysis on Conor Benn's recent behaviour and how everyone dislikes him right now, so I'll leave a link to that one in the description for those of you who haven't seen it. And between now and the April 26th fight, I'm not sure exactly how many Benn Eubank related videos I'll be able to get out, but remember, there is a part 2 of this video coming up about a certain major similarity with the family life of both Nigel Benn and Chris Eubank Sr. And it's not a thing where I'm going to be like, yeah, I might have that one in a couple weeks or something. No, I'm posting this very video after already having produced that part 2, so that will be up in the next couple of days. So if you're not subscribed, please do so now if you want to stay tuned for my little Benn vs Eubank pre-fight series. And if you are indeed watching this video over 2 days after its upload date, then luckily for you, I would have already posted part 2 of this one. So please do click on my channel to go and watch that one. But for now, thank you for making it to the end of this lengthy and girthy video, and you have been listening to O.M.E. Boxing.